Millions will line the streets to salute end of Elizabethan era. Roya Nickar, Tim Shipman and Caroline Wheeler detail the events of each day before the Queen's funeral a week tomorrow. Over the next 8 days the end of the Second Elizabethan Age will be marked with solemn ceremonial spectacle as the nation and the world mourn the longest-serving British monarch in history and pay tribute to her remarkable 70-year reign. As the new king mourns his mother and finally realizes his destiny, the first signs of how his reign will differ from hers will start to appear, as the king and queen consort embark on a tour to all corners of the United Kingdom. At the beginning of a period of national mourning for the UK, a vast diplomatic assembly will gather in London on a scale not seen since the state funeral of Winston Churchill in 1965. While every last detail of London Bridge, the code name for the Queen's death and her funeral, has been decades in the planning, some things cannot be prepared for. Will the capital really become full to bursting, a scenario planned for by the government, as hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of mourners from around the world descend on London to pay their respects? However the next days unfold, they are, in the words of a courtier, as much about the start of a new reign as they are about the death of a much-loved sovereign, a mix of mourning for the Queen and the start of a new monarch being visible. Today, having died at her beloved Balmoral Castle, where her family often said she was at her happiest, the Queen has lain in rest privately for 2 days in an oak coffin covered with the royal standard for Scotland and with a wreath of flowers laid on top. At 10 a.m. gamekeepers will carry her coffin to a hearse, which will travel via Aberdeen to the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh. Thousands of people are expected to line the route. A guard of honour formed by the Royal Regiment of Scotland will greet her with a royal salute. The business of becoming monarch will continue apace. King Charles will be proclaimed in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast and around the Commonwealth. This morning he will meet Baroness Scotland, Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, and will host a reception for the London-based High Commissioners of the Commonwealth countries of which he is king, including Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Belize, and St. Lucia. This afternoon at Buckingham Palace the King will also meet the Dean of Windsor, who will conduct the committal service at St. George's Chapel. This is set to be one of the most moving elements of the funeral in 8 days' time, as the Queen is lowered into the royal vault to rest alongside her beloved husband of 73 years, the Duke of Edinburgh, tomorrow. At the start of his brief reign, Edward VIII wrote of the days between the death and funeral of his father, King George V, "I had the uneasy sensation of being left alone on a vast stage." Unlike his great uncle, who could not bear to reign without the woman he loved, Charles will have the Queen consort by his side. She will join him in Scotland, at the start of his tour of the UK, and will accompany him throughout. Here is a first sign that Charles will deviate from his mother's style of rule. She did not undertake a national tour upon her accession, but courtiers say Charles is eager to meet people from all corners of the country as their new king. Motions of condolence will be heard at the Palace of Westminster before the king travels to the Palace of Holyrood House, the monarch's official residence north of the border. There, he will inspect a guard of honour, before taking part in the ceremony of the keys, in which the Lord Provost of Edinburgh hands the keys of the city to the monarch. The King and Queen consort will also attend a service at St. Giles Cathedral, and Charles will meet the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. A motion of condolence will be heard at the Scottish Parliament, followed by a reception. King Charles will escort the coffin to St. Giles Cathedral for a service attended by members of the royal family and dignitaries. The Crown of Scotland will be placed on the coffin and for 24 hours people will be able to pay their respects while a vigil is maintained by the Royal Company of Archers. The King and other royals will mount a vigil at 7:20 p.m. Tuesday. King Charles and the Queen consort will travel from Edinburgh to Belfast, where they will be welcomed at Hillsborough Castle, the official residence of the monarch in Northern Ireland. The King will hold audiences with the First Minister and the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly, before a reception at Hillsborough. The reception is expected to include community heroes and public sector workers to reflect, as a courtier has said, that from day one it is about the people rather than just the leaders being part of the new monarchy. A service at St. Anne's Cathedral in Belfast will end the day, before Charles and Camilla return to London. In Edinburgh, after 4:30 p.m. prayers at St. Giles Cathedral, the Queen's coffin will be carried in procession to the airport, where it will be placed on a flight to RAF Northolt, leaving at 6 p.m. The Princess Royal will accompany the coffin on the flight, which arrives at 6:55 p.m. It will travel in the state hearse to Buckingham Palace, where the Queen's Company, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, will place it on trestles in the bow room. Throughout the day, as the nation waits for the King's return to the capital, rehearsals will be taking place for the coffin's procession from the palace to the lying in state at Westminster Hall. The King and Queen Consort will witness the arrival of the coffin, along with other members of the royal family. Dame Sarah Mullally, Dean of the Chapels Royal, will conduct prayers. A rota of chaplains to the King, who were appointed by the Queen, will keep watch over the coffin. Wednesday. A solemn day as the Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard, moves from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Hall to lie in state for 5 days. In 2002 about 200,000 people filed past the Queen Mother's coffin, and in 1952 there were 4-mile queues as 300,000 mourners paid their respects to her husband, George VI. Buckingham Palace is expecting 500,000 people to attend the lying in state, but it is likely to be many more. In the early afternoon the coffin will be adorned with the imperial state crown, worn by the young Elizabeth after her coronation in 1953, with the scepter and orb and flowers gathered from royal gardens. At 2:22 p.m. Big Ben will begin to toll as the coffin, borne on a gun carriage by the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery, is carried in procession up the Mall, along Whitehall and into Parliament Square, a route expected to be lined with about 1 million mourners. The King and his family will walk behind the coffin. The coffin will arrive at the north door of Westminster Hall at 3 p.m., where a military bearer party will carry it to the catafalque, which will be draped in purple, to the sound of psalms. A service of prayer will be led by the Archbishop of Canterbury, attended by members of the royal family who do not join the procession. At the end of the service the King and Queen Consort, along with other members of the royal family, will return to Buckingham Palace by car. The King's bodyguards, the gentlemen-at-arms, the yeomen of the guard and the Royal Company of Archers, will begin a constant vigil around the coffin. From mid-afternoon Westminster Hall will be open around the clock to allow the public to see the Queen's coffin, closing only for a couple of hours at night for cleaning. Thursday. It will be a day of reflection for the King as he prepares to continue his national tour in Wales. Charles may mourn in private at Highgrove, his Gloucestershire home, before visiting Westminster Hall to see his mother lying in state. Friday. The King returns to Cardiff for a service at Llandaff Cathedral and a motion of condolence at the Senedd. He will hold audiences with the First Minister and presiding officer at Cardiff Castle, followed by a reception. Members of the royal family are also expected to visit other regions. Later Charles will return to Buckingham Palace to meet faith leaders. In a moving moment at Westminster Hall in the evening the King and his siblings, the Princess Royal, the Duke of York and the Earl of Wessex will hold a vigil at their mother's coffin, standing at the four corners of the catafalque. Saturday. A host of international royals, diplomats and dignitaries continue to gather in London and the King and Queen Consort will begin the day receiving governors-general and prime ministers from the realms. Later in the morning Charles will meet senior defence staff and visit the Metropolitan Police Commissioner to thank the police for their work. In the evening the King and Queen Consort, joined by other members of the royal family, will host foreign royals for a reception at Buckingham Palace. Sunday. Throughout the day, there are final preparations for the Queen's state funeral, the procession route from London to Windsor. In the morning, the King will hold an audience with the Prime Minister at Buckingham Palace, before joining the Queen Consort and other members of the royal family to meet the crowds outside. In the evening, the King will host a reception for visiting heads of state and foreign royals, governors-general, realm prime ministers and other visiting dignitaries. The public will finally learn how the late Queen wished to be mourned, with the release of the order of service for the funeral. Every last detail was chosen and signed off by the Queen herself. Monday. Queen Elizabeth II will become the first monarch since George II in 1760 to have her funeral in Westminster Abbey. At dawn, 6 a.m., on the last day of national mourning, the King's bodyguards begin their final vigil at the Queen's coffin in Westminster Hall, which will close at 8:30 a.m. At 9 a.m., Big Ben will strike clearly before the bell's hammer is covered with a thick leather pad to muffle its strikes for the rest of the day. At 10:30 a.m. the coffin will be moved on to the state gun carriage, used for the funerals of Diana, Princess of Wales and the Queen Mother. Hundreds of thousands of mourners will line the streets to see the Queen's final journey begin as the King and senior members of the royal family follow the funeral procession from Westminster Hall to the Abbey. There, at 11 a.m., the nation will fall silent. The televised state funeral will be led by the Dean of Westminster, with the Archbishop of Canterbury. About 2,000 guests will be inside the Abbey, and large screens in the capital's royal parks and across the country will broadcast what is expected to be one of the most watched live events in history. After the 1-hour service, the last post and reveille will echo around the Abbey. The Queen's coffin will be placed back on the state gun carriage and the royal funeral procession will move through Parliament Square, Whitehall, Constitution Hill and the Mall, to arrive at Wellington Arch at 1 p.m. From there the coffin will travel to Windsor, where the Queen spent much of her final years. Thousands are expected to line the streets as members of the royal family follow the hearse on foot and in carriages to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle via the Long Walk. The committal service conducted by the Dean of Windsor begins at 4 p.m. at the chapel, where 10 British monarchs are buried. It will be the final televised stage, and before the last hymn, the imperial state crown, scepter and orb will be removed from the coffin by the crown jeweler. At the end of the service, a lament will be played by a lone piper as the Queen's coffin is lowered into the royal vault. At 7 p.m., the King and only his closest family will return to St. George's Chapel for a private family burial service. As the late Queen did for her father, King Charles will scatter earth upon his mother's coffin.